Okay. Good evening, everybody, and welcome to this month's George Talk, which is being given to us by Burgess, who wrote this book and had it published last year, around the same time that Masha's book was published, George Orwell's Perverse Humanity. Glenn is a senior academic at Hull University and has been for a while, since he came from a long way down under, even further than Australia, from New Zealand. Over to you, Glenn.
Thank you very much, Quentin, and thank you for the invitation to speak this evening. And thank you everyone who's turned up to hear me. I hope you can now see my presentation on your screen, which, as Quentin has said, is about the book that I published with Bloomsbury Academic last year. He's already shown you the book, but there's another picture of it, just in case you would like to see the cover. The cover design is taken, in fact, from the cover illustration used on an edition of Orwell's Lion and the Unicorn. I'm going to begin with more or less three starting points. And the first of them, if you'll forgive me a little indulgence, is a sort of autobiographical one. I wanted to say a little bit about where the book came from in terms of my own scholarly career, because I think it gives some context for the book itself. I am by academic specialism an historian of political ideas, political thought, particularly the political thought of the 17th century, and even more particularly, the political thought of the English Revolution. And in that capacity, I have for a long time been interested in ideas of religious toleration and the way in which those ideas pass through the 18th century Enlightenment and come to inform a modern liberal understanding of free speech. At the same time, I've been very much interested in contemporary debates about free speech, which have become increasingly divisive and increasingly heated, and of course in which Orwell figures as a key reference point. And I've become interested indeed in the question that you can see on the screen: is a liberal theory of free speech the one that we've inherited from the early 19th century, and which is largely defining of how we view free speech issues today? Is it any longer fit for purpose given the nature of contemporary debates? To some degree, at least, Orwell himself was a proponent of a liberal idea of free speech, so are his views, like the rest of liberalism, any more suited to answering some of the challenges that we face today in this domain? This question about is liberalism fit for purpose? One of the thinkers in the intellectual circle around Orwell and Arthur Koestler in March 1945, Michael Polanyi, proposed a new journal that would be tasked with reinventing liberalism. And so this question that I asked, is liberalism fit for purpose, was one being asked in 1945, 46 in some of the intellectual circles around Orwell himself. Now that's a sort of intellectual context for where I approach this subject, which is to say, is not through a long-standing scholarly career writing about Orwell, but through an interest in the history of political ideas, and particularly the history of ideas of freedom of speech and intellectual freedom. My own personal circumstances: I spent 10 years as a senior manager in higher education, deputy vice-chancellor, and indeed a year as acting vice-chancellor, meant that I was unable to pursue proper research interests, but didn't want to consign myself to the intellectual graveyard, which seems to be the fate of so many senior managers. So I decided I would have to write about something that I could do sitting in my study at home. And thanks to Peter Davison, George Orwell seemed to be a key contender for this role. The 20 volumes of his collected works meant that I could sit and work without the need for archives, or indeed libraries, at least so I thought, although as it happens, the book does have rather more archival research in it than I first imagined. However, as it happened, I left senior management, returned to academic life, properly speaking, but no sooner had I done that than COVID-19 pandemic hit, and the book, much of the writing of the book was a product of the pandemic lockdown, where I continued to need to be able to write about something that didn't require me to leave my desk, or at least my study. Orwell seemed, both because of his long-standing association with the principles of freedom of speech, freedom of expression, freedom of the press, and because of his iconic role as at least a symbol of free speech in contemporary debates, to be a good way of connecting all of these things together. And so I embarked on writing the book that I'm now talking about. I assure you that will be the end of any autobiographical components of the talk. A second starting point is this quotation from Orwell's New Year message written in Tribune in January 1945, because it's this quotation, as you will no doubt know if you know the quotation, that gives the title to the book. We hold that the most perverse human being is more interesting than the most orthodox gramophone record. And the book is written very much as a tribute to human perversity, in the sense that Orwell mentioned that to the unorthodox, the heterodox, the dissenter, the nonconformist, all of those things that, all of those people that Orwell so valued, and which his thinking about freedom of speech was intended to validate and praise. And I hope that my book is written in the same spirit. And finally, the third of my starting points, more or less the first thing in the book, is a discussion of this person and the quotation behind him. The quotation was probably familiar to you, and it is from Orwell's famous unpublished preface to Animal Farm, Freedom of the Press. If liberty means anything at all, it means the right to tell people what they do not want to hear. And of course, it appears on the wall of the BBC headquarters in central London, behind the statue of Orwell that you can see there. Now, the person on the left, Billy Bragg, the well-known activist, folk singer, political activist of the left, published an article in The Guardian in 2020, taking exception to this statue, or rather not to the statue, but to the words behind it, the quotation. Carved into the wall beside him, he said, is a quote from the preface of Animal Farm. If liberty means anything at all, it means the right to tell people what they do not want to hear. It's a snappy slogan that fits neatly into a tweet. But whenever I walk past this effigy of the English writer that I most admire, it makes me cringe. Surely the author of 1984 would understand that people don't want to hear that 2 + 2 = 5. For Orwell's quote is not a defense of liberty, it's a demand for license, and has become a foundational slogan for those who willfully misconstrue one for the other. Strong words to use about the writer you most admire. It makes me cringe. Personally, though, I think Orwell meant more or less exactly what he said. It's not clear, indeed, that he recognized much of a distinction between liberty and license, though that doesn't necessarily mean that he thought freedom of speech was unfettered or unrestricted. But I think Billy Bragg is one reminder of the way in which Orwell's thought has become caught up in our own culture wars about freedom of speech and freedom of expression, but where the terrain has shifted quite markedly, so that figures on the left, like Billy Bragg, have themselves become critical of unrestricted freedom of expression, thinking it something that unleashes the capacity for hate speech, for giving offense, for insulting other people's dignity, and the like. And therefore, the left in particular has become increasingly distrustful of freedom of expression that is not, to some degree, constrained. Of course, it's not just the left. Oh, sorry, that is the freedom of the press, by the way, the first page of it, the typescript. I forgot to move the slide on. It's not just the left, of course, that is engaged in these culture wars, and Orwell can be as much a figure of interest to those on the right. This is a picture, of course, of the Canadian clinical psychologist and global public intellectual Jordan Peterson, for whom Orwell has been a major reference point, and of whom he's a professed admirer. But of course, like many on the right, he rather elides Orwell's commitment throughout most of his adult life to socialism. Jordan Peterson himself moving more and more to the right as time has gone on, and moving into very strongly anti-communist, but also anti-socialist, indeed anti-liberal terrain himself. Nonetheless, holds Orwell to be a hero, because not in spite of Billy Bragg, or in contrast to Billy Bragg, he holds him to be a hero precisely because of his opposition to all restraints on freedom of expression. So they are some starting points to how I came to write the book, where the title comes from, and some of a very brief introduction to the contemporary culture wars within which I was thinking about the book. In the end, the lessons of Orwell for today were only lightly touched in the book itself. They're not absent. I do begin with Billy Bragg, but I made less of them than I first envisaged. Whether that's a good or a bad thing, I hesitate to say. The book's divided into two large parts. One section trying to summarize key themes in Orwell's socialism, so an account of him as a socialist thinker. The second part, and a much larger part, on tracing his thinking and his ideas and his practices in relation, and his activism in relation to free speech issues or freedom of expression issues. I'm not going to say much about the socialism part, which was obviously written with the entirety of the project in mind. It's designed to explore the nature of a socialism that was open to a defense of liberal values around freedom of expression and other core liberal values and civic rights. But there are one or two things I want to draw out of this before I devote the most of the time I have to talking about what the book says about Orwell and freedom of speech. From the start, Orwell's socialism was of a curious sort, most notably in The Road to Wigan Pier, the second half of which, as I'm sure you will all know, was a strange expression of socialism, taking the form largely of an attack on virtually every other form of socialist imaginable. And among the things it says is this: that the socialist world is to be above all things an ordered world, an efficient world. But it is precisely from that vision of the future as a sort of glittering Wells world, reference of course to H.G. Wells, Wells world, that sensitive minds recoil. Now, of course, Orwell later perhaps refined some of his thinking about this, but never lost, I think, the view that many socialists didn't have a humane or a liberal vision of the future. And that was not true just of Soviet communists and other communists, for whom it is obviously the case, but many other socialists, that there were many forms of socialism that would not be admirable or desirable. And yet he also came to think that socialism was inevitable. If we mean by socialism a planned economy, a state-controlled economy, possibly with limited private property rights, but possibly not, but a collectivized economy under state control and planned, then something of this sort was inevitable. And Orwell very quickly came to and repeatedly said, Socialism in some form is inevitable. The question is, would it also be a good thing? And in a sense, his core intellectual project, as again, I'm sure is familiar to many, is how to develop, propagate, defend, and promote a form of socialism that would be a good and not a bad thing. That, in other words, would be liberal, humane, humanitarian, decent, and all of the things that Orwell valued. It's interesting, just in passing, to ask the question that if Orwell had ceased to believe that socialism was inevitable, what difference would that have made to his thinking? Because the bedrock of his commitment to socialism was the belief that that something like it was inevitable, inescapable, and so therefore, it's a question worth asking. I'm not going to answer it though, but nonetheless, it's an interesting thought. I want to say something now before I pass on about libertarian socialism, and in particular the period around 1945-46, where I think Orwell's liberal as opposed to his socialist commitments were most central and most germane. The term libertarian socialism was used of Orwell by Bernard Crick and by others. Crick spent some time defending that label. But interestingly, he didn't invent it out of nothing. At least he may have done, but it did have contemporary resonance, as I'll explain in a moment. I think the point in calling Orwell a libertarian socialist, for me, if not necessarily for Bernard Crick, is to make the point that he did not just think that socialism and liberalism were in some ways compatible, that you could have a socialism that maintained and perpetuated the liberal freedoms that England in particular, England more than anywhere, had acquired over the 19th and early 20th century. It's more importantly, I think, and more forcefully, he believed that socialism itself, in its early days and through to at least the Russian Revolution, was in a sense the fulfillment of liberalism, that it was, if you like, a later development of the same impulse. As he said, in 1940, inside the Whale, it was once thought that socialism could preserve and even enlarge the atmosphere of liberalism. And that's very much what he thought. And there are a number of statements like this, that socialism wasn't just something compatible with liberalism, but more centrally, it could be seen as its ultimate end point, because socialism guaranteed that the values and the freedoms of a liberal society would be accessible to everybody, not just to the wealthy. And the danger of the Soviet myth, as that developed in the decades after 1917, was not just that the Soviet Union was a totalitarian and oppressive state that denied freedom to its own citizens, but that it came to capture in the minds of many the hopes for socialism. There were many in Western countries who saw in the Soviet Union the only viable form of socialism. It came to be what socialism meant, and thus blinded people to the earlier liberal or libertarian socialisms in which Orwell believed. The Soviet myth clouded one's view of the past and the true nature of socialism, and even worse, intellectuals who were attached to the view that the Soviet myth somehow meant that the Soviet Union was the great hope, the great symbol of the achievement of socialism in the world, therefore began to self-censor any criticisms they might have of that regime. They began to deny the truth, even truths that they knew of themselves. They began to believe that this achievement of socialism in its Soviet form was so important and so central that any intellectual means of whatever integrity or lack of integrity would be justified in achieving it. As I've said, libertarian socialism was a phrase used at the time. Gilbert Hall, the editor of Commonwealth Review, wrote to Arthur Koestler in March 1946, "We're particularly concerned to propagate the ideas of libertarian socialism, socialists who still believe in the value of human individuality, people like yourself, George Orwell, Herbert Reed, and so on." Socialists who still believe, in other words, retain that original socialist vision in the value of human individuality. Koestler's correspondence with David Martin also indicates that Orwell and Reed, Herbert Reed, had agreed to serve on the editorial board of a new international review dedicated to libertarian socialism, exploring the task of how to combine individual freedom with a state-controlled economy. And that, indeed, for Orwell, was essentially the challenge posed by the modern world and its development. That, in a sense, is all that I wanted to say about what I say in the book about Orwell's socialism. There is a good deal more, but I want to concentrate my time on the libertarian side of this libertarian socialism, and to devote the rest of the talk to Orwell's liberalism, free speech. Just a word on, when I was preparing these slides this afternoon, it suddenly occurred to me for the first time to think about the history of libertarian. What does the word libertarian and libertarian socialism actually mean? Does it differ in any way from liberalism? So I don't know why this hadn't occurred to me before, but I looked at the Oxford English Dictionary's dating of different senses of the word. And what is interesting is that it was in precisely these sorts of years, 1944 to 1948, that the first uses recorded by the Oxford English Dictionary of libertarian and libertarianism in its modern sense as a sort of individualist, quasi-anarchist, and now often, though not invariably, right-wing ideology first happened. Earlier, libertarianism was largely indistinguishable. Libertarian as an adjective was largely indistinguishable from liberal. It meant someone who believed in liberty. Even before that, a libertarian was someone who believed in free will. So it's an interesting succession of ideas, and it is interesting that these years on which I'm focusing, the mid-1940s, actually see an interesting transition in the use of this term, though how much the people I've just quoted were aware of that, I don't know. Largely because I've only just begun to think about the matter a few hours ago. So Orwell on free speech. What I'm not going to do here, though I have done it in the book, is go through painstakingly Orwell's great essays on freedom of speech, like freedom of the press, like the protection of literature, and many others. The Writer and Leviathan, and all of the essays that are very familiar. I do that work in the book, but I want to focus on some of the other aspects of the book that are perhaps less familiar to some. And the first thing, and one of the things I try to emphasize in the book, is that Orwell, particularly in these years of the mid-1940s, was not just writing about freedom of speech. He was an activist in the cause of freedom of speech. Now, of course, his writing was itself a form of activism always, and one shouldn't deny or neglect that. But he went beyond just writing about things to become actively campaigning for and working for the defense of intellectual freedom, a sign of how much importance he attached to it, particularly given how disinclined Orwell generally was to join political groups and political movements. He did join the Independent Labour Party after coming back from Spain, and wrote a nice essay about why he did so. But I don't think he joined many other political or activist groups, if any. So Orwell was not just a writer, he was an activist for freedom, and particularly in these years. I mentioned on the slide the Penn Club, now Penn International, founded in 1921, PEN, of course, stands for Poets, Essayists, and Novelists. I think it's a writers' club in origin. Arthur Koestler proposed to Orwell at this point, I think it was in 1945, that perhaps he'd like to become its chair or president. I can't remember what the title was. I don't think that proposal went anywhere, and I'm not entirely sure with what authority Koestler made the suggestion. But it's interesting that he saw Orwell as a suitable person for such a role. More significant, though, at least in Orwell's life, was his involvement in two initiatives. One was the Freedom Defence Committee, formed in early 1945 by a group of anarchists to defend a collection of anarchist editors who had been, under wartime regulation, tried and sentenced to terms of imprisonment, I think, in April 1945. The issue really amongst these so-called Freedom Press anarchists was that towards the end of 1944, as the war visibly neared its end, these anarchist writers began to propagate the idea that maybe demobilized soldiers would be fertile ground for anarchist, socialist, perhaps even revolutionary politics. And the government seems to have become a little bit anxious about this, perhaps thinking to some of what happened after the First World War. Masses of demobilized soldiers with high expectations about having made the world a better and freer place might well be a difficult problem. Anyway, legal action was taken, and a committee was formed quickly to defend them. By August 1945, when this particular issue that created the committee had passed, and it had become a broader organization to defend freedom of speech, freedom of expression, and freedom of action more generally, it was constituted. There are a couple of pamphlets, indeed, outlining its constitution, with Herbert Reed, whom we've already heard mention of, but who was an anarchist as much as a socialist, though the two, of course, could be fused. He was its chairman, Orwell the vice chair, and George Woodcock the secretary, who did most of the work. This tends to be the way with secretaries in these sorts of organizations. It made a particular point in this more broadly constituted form of defending those even with whom one disagreed. As the Aims and Constitution document says, we will support people irrespective of their political views. A key crunch point in the formation of this group and its broadening from its initial starting point was a suspicion that the body that existed most obviously to defend civil liberties generally, but including freedom of speech, was the NCCL, the National Council for Civil Liberties, nowadays known as Liberty. And in particular, there was a feeling that Orwell shared with many of those involved in the Freedom Defence Committee and with his friend Arthur Koestler and others, that the NCCL was a Soviet front. I'm not sure that that's entirely true, though certainly there were key members in the NCCL who were communist sympathizers or crypto-communists or fellow travelers. The issue that seems to have undermined the NCCL's credibility for many was its strong commitment to combating anti-Semitism and fascism. In other words, rather than being, in a sense, neutral between fascism, communism, and everything between those two extremes, it took a more overtly political and anti-fascist line. So, for example, when Mosley was released from internment in 1943, the NCCL campaigned and continued to campaign for his re-imprisonment, arguing that that because fascists were themselves illiberal, intolerant opponents of free expression, that then Mosley should be kept out of the public arena. Orwell and a good many others, including a number of angry correspondents writing to the NCCL, strongly disagreed. And we'll return to Moseley a little bit later. The Freedom Defence Committee existed for a number of years, right through to 1948, but it had a difficult existence, largely financial, with several attempts to write to lots of people to get them to contribute to its funds. One of the most generous contributors was Victor Gollancz, the publisher. But in 1948, Orwell was the second largest donor to the Freedom Defence Committee. Well, 1948, it might have been 1947. Herbert Reed was later to write, as the organization was essentially collapsing in December 1948, he wrote, "When I took it on, I had George Orwell as a vice chairman, but he has been almost continuously ill and no help at all." It's probably true. I don't think Orwell's talents lay in the organizational work needed to maintain an organization like this. But his commitment to it, I think, was for a long time not in doubt. He corresponded about various cases. He wrote petitions. Some cases that the Freedom Defence Committee looked at or pursued came through him, and so on. So his commitment and indeed his work within the auspices of the Freedom Defence Committee was more significant, even if he didn't contribute much as vice chairman and didn't give much help to Reed and Woodcock in actually maintaining it. Second initiative that Orwell was involved in, which might, I think, fall under this activist class, was one about which there has been a growing amount of attention in the last few years, his attempt with Arthur Koestler to form a league for the dignity and rights of man. A project that formed when Orwell went to visit the Koestlers, well, Koestler and Mamain Paget for Christmas 1946. Koestler was later to say of Orwell at this moment, "I do not think I've ever seen him so happy as when we discussed the projected league." The idea seems to have been primarily Koestler's in origin, and it can be traced back in a number of his letters, the thoughts behind it. But it is, in a sense, at least from Orwell's perspective, I think an internationalization of the Freedom Defence Committee, and builds also on the same perception that the NCCL was a pro-Soviet organization and not even-handed in its defense of civil liberties, including freedom of speech. There survive from this project 2 draft manifestos. The first of them, more than the second, linking equality and freedom. They're both in the Orwell archive, though the relationship between them is a little bit mysterious. I do write quite a lot about this in the book, but I'm not going to repeat it here. But it was, in a sense, a project to create an international organization to protect dignity and rights of men. Now, the project was largely defunct by about July 1946 for a variety of reasons. One is a key player in this project as it emerged was Bertrand Russell, and Koestler had one of, I think, more than one, but a particularly critical falling out with Bertrand Russell during the course of the project, as well as the fact that Russell himself wanted to do something slightly different from the original vision, which was around the defense of civil liberties, particularly freedom of expression. At the same time, a key launch conference was going to be organized in Easter 1946, funded by Rodney Phillips, who had been also funding the journal Polemic, edited by Humphrey Slater. And Slater and Phillips together were going to enable this conference to happen in Wales near the Koestler farmhouse. But they pulled the funding. They became suspicious that there was a plot essentially to take over the journal Polemic and make a mouthpiece of this initiative. So in somewhat extravagant terms, Slater pulled out of the project. That also didn't do it any help. At the same time, Orwell, of course, in May 1946, I think it was, went to Jura and began what became the focal work for the rest of his life, essentially, the writing and completion of 1984. Well, he may not have begun it at this time, but he began in earnest the writing of 1984. So for a variety of reasons, the project didn't get off the ground, but I think it is telling, both the sense in which Koestler attributed so much importance to this in Orwell's eyes and the enthusiasm with which they began the project. Again, that sense that freedom needed active support, not just the power of the pen. The ideas behind the League may well have fed forward into the Congress for Cultural Freedom, which Arthur Koestler addressed. You can see him doing so in the picture there in 1950, but from which he was soon sidelined as being too anti-communist, even for the Congress for Cultural Freedom. The Congress, of course, became the channel through which the CIA funded much of the cultural Cold War, with or without the knowledge of many of those whom they funded. And indeed, Melvin Lasky, one of the key players in its establishment, attributed the spirit of Orwell as the founding spirit of the Congress and its work. And the first publication of the second and final version of the League's proposed, or the proposed League's manifesto, was unearthed when David Smith, I think it was, who published in his book on Orwell Illustrated, or whatever that book's called, I can't remember, a few years ago, found it in the papers of Ruth Fisher, to whom Koestler had sent it in the prelude to thinking about the establishment of the Congress for Cultural Freedom. So in the end, it did have a sort of afterlife, though whether in this particular form as a key institution of the cultural Cold War, Orwell would have altogether approved of the Congress for Cultural Freedom, it is difficult to know. Well, impossible to know, might be a truer estimate. That is the final version of the League Manifesto, which actually exists in many, many versions. There are multiple copies of it in the Koestler papers. It was sent to Victor Galantz, and it is in his papers at Warwick, as well as the copy. It's in the Orwell archive. As a result of this work, I mean, Orwell's attitudes to freedom of expression were tested in the public domain. And here's, on the left, Woodcock's summary of the position that he came to occupy. They were tested not just in the public domain, but tested in practice against cases. He shared that is to say, the anarchists' sense of freedom as an absolute good, and showed this in the days when he and I worked together on the Freedom Defence Committee in the middle 1940s. And he insisted that we must fight for fair treatment by the police and the courts, not only for those whose views we shared, but also for those whose views we detested, such as communists and fascists. One of the things on which the committee had worked was the purge of the civil service, primarily of communists, but to some degree of fascists as well. And although they didn't altogether oppose careful vetting of the civil service, they did do their best to ensure that due process, proper evidence, fairness of proceeding would characterize any such activity. On the right, quotation from Orwell himself, writing to Woodcock in January 1948, where he begins by talking about an argument that he's himself used. If you're not my enemy's enemy, then you're their friend, basically, an argument which he'd used widely against anarchists and pacifists in the Second World War, but later became rather shamefaced about. But what he says here in the end is, the argument doesn't work in the end. If you take this line, you don't really defend freedom at all, and the conditions on which you can restrict freedom of expression must be very narrow. It must be a real and not merely a theoretical threat to democracy. No one should be persecuted for expressing his opinions, however antisocial. Billy Bragg should remember then that Orwell was not making the distinction he wanted to make in the terms he wanted to make between between liberty and license. The only justification for suppressing an organization or speech would be a substantial threat to the stability of the state. As I say, Orwell had the chance to test this out in some hard cases. I've already talked about Mosley, so in the interest of time, I'll probably pass over that a bit. But Orwell essentially expressed the view that it was right to imprison Mosley early in the war, to intern him, because he represented a real threat of subversion to the state. He could have betrayed. It's conceivable that particularly in the event of a German invasion, that he could have betrayed the British people directly to the Nazis, and therefore he needed, for the public safety, to be kept out of harm's way, or so to speak. But once that had passed, then the fact that he was a fascist, an illiberal, and obnoxious in virtually every way describable, should not keep him behind bars. It was right then to release him. It's only when the threat is immediate and specific. Similarly, when Ezra Pound, the poet on the right, was awarded the inaugural Bollingen Prize in 1949, Bollingen Prize in Poetry, the magazine Partisan Review ran a symposium of people they invited to consider should this person be allowed to win this prize. After all, he'd made fascist broadcasts from Italy. He'd only escaped imprisonment for treason or condemnation for treason by put in an asylum instead. He was an out-and-out fascist and anti-Semite. It's interesting if you read Orwell's quite well-known little statement on this in the context of all the other contributions to Partisan Review, because it really stands out for its directness, its clarity of thought. It makes you admire again just how effective a writer Orwell could be in this form, and how clearly and directly he could speak his mind. It just begins with the statement: if they think he's the best poet of the year, then of course he should have been awarded the prize. It doesn't take away the fact that he's an obnoxious fascist, and we shouldn't allow his poetry to obscure that fact. But nonetheless, these are distinct things. He's allowed to speak his mind, and he's allowed to win a poetry prize. Orwell did, in fact, doubt that he was that good a poet, but that's a separate issue. I mean, it was a very clear expression. However obnoxious, if they thought he should win the prize, then he should be awarded it. I'll pass over this about Mosley, which makes the point I've already made. But these two cases make, I think, very clear exactly what Orwell thought, that there were largely very few limits. Now, I don't have time to go through all of this material here, but one of the things I did do in the book and do write about is Orwell's own experience of being censored. And it's something I added to the book only very late in the day. It suddenly occurred to me, having written and been focused on what you might call political censorship, the political issues around freedom of expression and so on, I'd overlooked the most obvious way in which early Orwell, at least in the 1930s, in his early novels, had in fact suffered censorship, and that was to say, through the extensive work done to remove both the risk of libel, but also any obscenity from his books. It's possible early on that Burmese Days struggled to get into press, but thanks to the India office and its anti-imperialism. But I don't think there's any evidence of that except what Orwell later wrote. But obscenity is interesting, and I explore at length the struggle through, particularly the early books from Down and Out in Paris and London, through Clergyman's Daughter and Keep the Aspidistra Flying, all of which had a difficult passage, taking out, and it was particularly damaging for for A Clergyman's Daughter, I think, and the famous scene in which Dorothy lives on the streets of central London alongside many other tramps and Down and Out, and he does a lot to capture their speech. It's largely in direct speech. And there's no doubt, I won't go through these quotations, that he thought that the censorship of obscenity was foolish, partly because it prevented the authentic capturing of popular speech. It was simply not restricted a writer, but partly I think also just because he thought actually if you allow swear words and the like to become normalized, and they cease to lose their shock value, they become less harmful potentially. It doesn't mean that he was without any dislike of obscenity. There were limits, and he could sometimes express disgust, dislike about forms of writing that were obscene. But even then, and once again, that did not lead him to advocate censorship. In his essay on Dali's autobiography, for example, he says directly, not of course that Dali's autobiography or his pictures ought to be suppressed, short of the dirty postcards that used to be sold in Mediterranean seaport towns. Now, I actually don't know exactly what they are. I have wondered slightly. I mean, obviously, they're not the smutty seaside postcards that he was familiar with from England, and which he wrote a fine essay about, which was quoted on the previous slide. I presume these are more hardcore pornographic in content, but I don't know. But anyway, apart from these, it's doubtful policy to suppress anything. And Dali's fantasies probably cast useful light on the decay of capitalist civilization. They're useful data, if you like, useful evidence, however obscene. What he clearly needs is diagnosis. A nice line to end it on. But again, that refusal to step to the level of censorship. The book also looks at what you might call the illiberal Orwell, if there was such a thing. Does his work for the BBC, or does his giving of the list of names to the Information Research Department of the Foreign Office in 1949 compromise this liberalism, this on the one hand seemingly unrestricted belief in freedom of expression, or largely unrestricted? Is it not compromised? Again, I haven't got the time left to go into this in detail, but I think it's worth reflecting on that famous diary entry, all propaganda is lies. Bear with me, I apologize. All propaganda is lies, even when one is telling the truth. I don't think this matters so long as one knows what one is doing and why. Now, Orwell's relationship with the BBC was agonized and complex. He didn't leave it because of censorship or because he felt that he was being forced to say what he didn't think. He left it because he didn't get on with its bureaucratic way of running, and because he thought what he was doing was useless and ineffective, for which there's some evidence. But I think what he is saying in the quotation, there are many other similar quotations, is that so long as you hang on to a sense of the truth, sometimes, just as with the need to inter Mosley, sometimes necessity, particularly in wartime, might require doing things, but don't abandon a sense of where the boundaries to decency and where the boundaries to truth lie. It does not, in the end, I think, the case that his work for the BBC compromises his claims of either intellectual integrity or belief or particular nature of his freedom of speech. Nor, I think, and I'll pass over this very quickly, does his famous list, which you can see on the left there, given through Celia Kerwin to the Information Research Department, in the sense that Orwell did not give this list in the belief that it was a list of names of people to be suppressed or censored. Rather, they were the people who were not to be invited to write anti-Soviet propaganda on the grounds that they might well be too sympathetic to that which they were writing against. There's no sense in which any of the names on the list were people who believed whose views should be actively suppressed, rather to defend the cause of freedom against the Soviet Union. Again, I don't think, though it remains a controversial episode. So I am getting towards the end, you'll be pleased to know. What all of this amounts to, and again, I could defend this at much greater length than I do in the book, is that Orwell was not in the end, a simple believer in what we might call a liberal defense of free speech, as we often understand that now. A liberal defense of free speech defends it essentially as a right, that is to say, a right that you can protect. It gives you the space to speak your mind. It's a right that you can use or not use. It's a right, in other words, that prevents you from being interfered with by other people, particularly by governments and the law, but also by your fellow citizens. But for Orwell, free speech was not just a liberal right, and that's why his account of it needs to be understood more, I think, as a democratic duty to speak the truth. And a consequence of that is that free speech is only possible in certain cultural environments. That is to say, unless there is a respect for truth, unless there are institutions of the press and the like that enable a diversity of viewpoints to be expressed, then that duty cannot be exercised effectively. It's more than a right. And Orwell was very alert to the ways in which it could be compromised by informal as well as formal means, but the way in which it would be compromised in capitalist and democratic societies as well as in totalitarian ones. As he said, with regard to Homage to Catalonia, 10 years ago, it was almost impossible to get anything printed in favor of communism. Today, it's almost impossible to get anything printed in favor of anarchism or Trotskyism. He was always alert to that dimension. And censorship was not the only problem. It was that informal, the power of the press exercised by the wealthy or the powerful. The role of prefabricated language, which he wrote much about, that disguised even from people themselves their inability and unwillingness to think for themselves, but simply to draw upon the jargon, the ready-made phrase, which was a denial of thought altogether and a denial of truth. The fear that led, or the ideologies that led to conformity and self-censorship. And as he became aware of and wrote extensively about from the Spanish Civil War onwards, the abandonment of truth, what we call post-truth, the belief that what you said was scarcely regulated by a thought of its truthfulness, but only by its usefulness and effectiveness. So Orwell's defense of freedom of speech was not just a narrowly liberal right, it was a broader defense of a culture of freedom and truth-telling, a culture of outspokenness, the culture of perverse humanity. And so if we finally reflect on today's challenges, sorry, this is a statement where he's simply talking about how difficult he found it to exercise that heterodox, heretical attitude himself, and how, although he managed it, many others, many younger or less determined writers would succumb to conformity. If we look at today's free speech, and I haven't got time to work my way through this in detail, but so I'll close with just a few quick thoughts. We are in a very different world. Technology has changed the basis for the public culture we operate. In particular, social media has changed it. Capitalist societies might have been had their freedom undermined by the wealthy and the powerful, but the fact that they also created some barrier to expression. You had to get your work published in a newspaper. There were relatively few outlets. There were barriers to entry into the public space in which you could speak your mind. May well have had some positive consequences if we consider the alternative today, when the barriers are virtually none. Anybody, anonymously or in their own persona, can say virtually whatever they like in some form about anything. And is that free for all a good thing or a bad thing? We've, in a sense, to some degree, arrived at a world in which technology has created this absence of distinction between liberty and license. Is it a good thing? Similarly, that same world has become a post-truth world. in which we're vulnerable to governments like the Russian government today, which can spew out fake stories, interfere by digital means with elections, issue propaganda that's indistinguishable from the truth. Again, do we now need to think not of how we are lucky to have this level of freedom, but how we need to regulate our way out of it? And thirdly, we live in a world where the chilling effects of self-censorship are very real. The problems associated by accusations of wokeness, by accusations of hate speech, by the politics of identity, which lead people to become very defensive of their right not to be insulted. Think back to the league that Koestler and Orwell planned, a league for the dignity and rights of man. But we are now in a world where one person's rights are now that is to say, to free speech, are often taken to be an insult or to be undermining of another person's dignity. Which comes first, rights or dignity? I think for Orwell, the value of a perverse humanity would remain important. The need to live in a world of in which that perversity, that heterodoxy, can get expressed, must remain crucial. But we live in an environment where the surrounding culture, in crucial ways, makes that much more difficult. It's not the sort of world that Orwell himself lived in. So thank you very much for listening. I hope that's given you some sense of what's in my book, and I'd be very interested to hear any questions.
Thank you very much, Glenn. That was very interesting and certainly a different approach to many we're used to seeing. If everybody could unmute now before we have questions to say thank you to Glenn, so that I don't forget to do that, which sadly I've done with some speakers. So if you could unmute.
Thank you, Glenn.
Thank you very much.
Jeffrey, you had a question a long time ago. You've been very patiently waiting, but we don't normally take questions in the middle. So please.
Thank you, Quentin. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, fine, thanks.
As you noted in your foreword, Glenn, to the book, the project was done during the lockdowns of COVID. All I can say is if that is the only good thing to come out of the pandemic, then the pain we all went through was well worth it. I almost just finished your book and I found it most interesting. I should congratulate you, before I ask you the question, I should congratulate you on the excellent and simple to follow footnotes and not endnotes. Thank goodness they weren't endnotes. 514 of them, and they made the reading of the book a pure delight. Very few publishers now do this with footnotes, and I found it really very easy to follow where you got your research from. So thank you for doing that. I want to ask you two questions. It's more about the actual content of the book than what you were actually speaking about. It's morning here in Melbourne, so this morning. I want to ask you, do you think Orwell goes further than James Burnham in his criticism of why the revolution had failed? So was he beginning to become critical of James Burnham? I'm particularly thinking of the Goldstein book in 1984. And secondly, and sort of related to that, do you think Orwell is critical of Marx and Engels, who originally spearheaded the socialist movement? So in other words, was he beginning to become critical of James Burnham, and even more so, do you think that there was an underlying criticism in Orwell's writings, particularly in 1984, of the founder of the whole movement, Marx?
Thank you very much for the questions. I did see your hand up earlier, but I wasn't sure whether I should stop or not. But I'm glad to have the question now. Just on the question of footnotes. I mean, I'm like you, it seems, a great believer in the in having footnotes at the bottom of the page, because otherwise they're hard to. And so I turned in the typescript to the publishers with them at the bottom of the page, fully expecting they would demand to have them at the back. Publishers seem to think they're so off-putting to readers and so inclined to badge a book as irredeemably academic and therefore esoteric that they like to hide them as far as possible. But actually, they never questioned them and never became an issue. So it just turned up with the book footnotes at the bottom, and I was pleased not to have to fight the case. On the questions, first of all, Marx and Engels. I mean, I'll do them in reverse order. It's an interesting question. There is some doubt, I think, about just how familiar with Marx and Engels Orwell was beyond the basics. And I think, if I remember rightly, I think it's John Rodden has written a short essay about this very topic. And if I remember, the verdict is it probably he was reasonably widely read, at least early on, even if he almost makes no reference to their writing specifically. Probably Masha Karp would be a better answer to some aspects of this question, because I think Orwell, he said slightly inconsistent things, but I think he certainly believed that that if you like, Stalinism, if you think of that sort of that simple genealogy, Marx begat Lenin, who begat Stalin, and so therefore the sins of Stalinism were inherent in the in Marxism to start with. I think there's reason to think that Orwell might have believed the second of those steps, the Lenin to Stalin one, though not always unambiguously so. And I think he also sometimes thought, certainly could see the original liberationist aspirations of the Russian Revolution, however quickly and indeed however inevitably betrayed. But what he thought of the step from Marx to Lenin is a more difficult question to answer. And I think I'm not entirely sure that I know the answer. And whether there is built into this a criticism of Marx himself, or of Engels for that matter. I think, my personal view is that Marx himself was much more of a liberal, with a strong commitment to certain aspects of the liberal achievement through his life. Certainly very early on, when some of his very earliest writing about freedom of the press. But I don't know. And what is interesting too about Orwell, again, Masha Karp would know more than me and probably be able to comment better, is that I think it's in the preface to the Ukrainian translation of Animal Farm, where he basically says, it's up to the people who live within a country to take responsibility for what it is and what it becomes. If reading Animal Farm in Ukrainian helps Ukrainians to that point of doing something to better their own lives, that's good. But he pulled back from saying, from overt criticism of the Soviet Union, to the extent of saying that it should be toppled from without. It was up to the Russian people in the end to see the truth and to come to that point. So I don't know about Marx, and if anyone else has any more views on that, I'm interested to know. I think it's hard to tell from what he wrote, what he said about these matters. On James Baldwin, James Burnham. I've been writing about James Baldwin recently too. That's a different matter altogether. On James Burnham, I think, Burnham's a very interesting figure. The way he moved from the Trotskyist left, right through to the far right by the time he died, and the two books that Orwell knew, the Managerial Revolution and the Machiavellians, were sort of steps, to the early steps on that rightward trend. And Orwell, of course, in his essays, famously discerned in Burnham's writing what he thought was a form of power worship. Though that was partly because he misread an essay in Partisan Review. But I think that he I think he came to, I mean, some key ideas, certainly. I think he came to share with Burnham, of course, which figure in 1984, namely the ideas of the managerial revolution, the idea that there was a technocratic elite of managers, scientists, and the like, could be it could essentially be the group that seized power and dominated societies in the future, not the not the proletariat or any broader social group. I think he took that seriously, but perhaps as a Democrat, as a threat to democracy more than anything else. I think in the end, I'm sort of struggling to come to a conclusion in my own head. But I guess one of the things I say in the book is that I think Orwell never abandoned hope in the late 1940s. He always believed that revolution was possible, however unlikely and however distant it might be, and that it was always possible to produce something better. So I think he was very resistant in the end to Burnham's, almost his determinism, you might say, his belief that the cause of revolution was irrevocably lost, and that societies would go down this managed route, almost without choice, really. I think Orwell always wanted to keep alive that however much as hopes for revolutionary change faded, they were never lost or completely eradicated. There's an interesting passage, I think it's in Stephen Spender's book, called The 30s and After, where he's talking about Orwell's attitude to the Labour government, which again is a subject that's attracted a degree of difference of interpretation. But with Spender's line is that although he could appreciate some of the things that might be doing, he never made the mistake of mistaking it for genuine socialist change, and he never fell for that. And I don't always think Spender's reading of Orwell is entirely convincing, but in this point, I think it probably is. So I think where he began to differ from Burnham was over the sense of power would always win, and it was going irreversibly in a certain direction. In the end, Orwell did not ever accept the irreversibility of trends, I think. Not a complete answer to your question. They need more thought.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much. Felicity Nemo.
Thank you. I think that the critic who says that Orwell's remark, freedom of speech is the freedom to tell people things they don't want to hear, confuses liberty with license, is himself confusing the right to tell people what they don't want to hear with the right to make them pay attention to you. Of course you have the right to tell people that 2 and 2 equal 5. They just don't have to stick around and talk to you about it.
That's absolutely right. Yes, and I think, yeah, it's a strange form of intolerance. It says, who wants to be told 2 + 2 = 5? You're right. You don't need to listen or take any notice to what anyone says. Orwell was a master himself at not listening to people that he disagreed with, or at least misrepresenting them at times. So yeah, I agree entirely. It's a strange confusion, but it's a telling one in some ways, isn't it? Because I think it's odd how in modern societies, and it's partly the impact perhaps of the sensitivities around hate speech, around race and gender and other things, that sense in which people don't want to hear what they might find offensive or upsetting or challenging even. And the most common way of putting this is not usually that they don't believe in free speech, but they find all sorts of buts and maybes. I believe in free speech, but as ways around it. And this is just another example of that. I believe in free speech, but I don't want to hear about your mathematical errors, or your errors in arithmetic, or I don't want to hear what your views on gender. So I think it's interesting that he chose also that 2+2 example, because obviously he's picking on something that's an obvious truth. No one would deny that 2+2 = 5 is a falsehood. So he's in a sense manipulating your response by choosing an undeniable falsehood and saying, why should people propagate falsehood? But of course, heresies are often initially dismissed as falsehoods and later become truths. And as Mill famously said, if you can't defend yourself, you can't defend your own views against others, then what you see are your views themselves. How do you know that they're valid if you can't subject them to that sort of test? So yeah, I agree entirely. None of us get to listen to anybody.
Note also the stupid expression verbal violence, which often gets brought up here, as if hearing something that makes you feel bad is a form of violence, like being slugged, and hence should be put to sanctions.
Yeah, I think that's another one of the rhetorical tactics, isn't it? The inflation of the concept of violence to include upsetting, offending, and the like. And so it's routinely used in attempts, particularly from the left, to deny free speech to people.
Masha, I think I see your hand up.
Thank you very much. I will have to ask somebody to teach me how to do yellow hand in this version of Zoom. Somehow I used to know how to do it in the previous version, but I don't know how to do it in this one. But I won't waste time on it now. I just wanted to thank Glenn for his very interesting talk and interesting things to explore here. I would like to make 3 very quick comments and 1 question. One comment is because you provoked me by talking about Marx, because I just wanted to quote a wonderful letter of Eileen, where she says that they got a dog Marx because they hadn't yet read Marx by that time. And then when they read Marx, they are ashamed to look the dog in the eyes. But obviously, Lenin did not, you were absolutely right, Lenin did not follow Marx in any way. Even the simplest things like that the revolution should happen, Marx was saying, in a developed society. Lenin said, nonsense, we'll do the revolution in the weak society where proletariat is not yet strong, and then the idea of socialism in one country, it also contradicts what Marx was saying, and so on. But this is let me sorry. Саш, не могу, извини, перезвоню. But this was one comment. The second was about Ruth Fisher and what you mentioned about the Congress for Cultural Freedom. Obviously, the drafts of the League for the Dignity of Man were found in her papers, but the conference where Koestler spoke in 1950 was prepared by 3 people, all of whom Orwell knew very well. They were Ruth Fisher, Franz Borkenau, and Mel Lasky. Obviously, Borkenau more than others. And that's why I think the connection between the League and Orwell's aspirations for it and the Congress is maybe stronger than people had previously thought. Now, the third very quick comment, because you said absolutely correctly about the technology and how this is used by the Russian government, who does the propaganda pretending that it is absolute truth and all that. But they also, what they do is the so-called trolls. The troll factory, where if you publish something on Facebook, you would openly for the general use, you would immediately have at least half a dozen of people who definitely had been specially trained to react to any anti-government comments. That's why I personally only limit the circle by friends, because I know that otherwise I will have to deal with it. But these were brief comments. Now the question is maybe more serious. The question is, you were saying that lots of people were taking Soviet socialism to mean socialism in general. But have we had any examples of authoritarian socialism existing anywhere but as except as a wonderful dream of mankind? And Orwell himself was talking about utopian socialists and all that. Yes, as a dream, it has always existed and maybe still exists. Do we have any examples of any other socialism, proper socialism, with a state-owned economy en masse, not just separate branches? So sorry for this long monologue.
No, thank you very much for the three comments, both of which are, all of which are very interesting. I won't comment on any of them except the links between the League and the Congress for Cultural Freedom. I think, yes, I was initially resistant to the idea of connecting them too closely, but I think you're right. I mean, and your own work has made very clear the role of people like Borkenau and Melvin Lasky as well in Orwell's life and work, and those connections are, and it was Lasky who claimed that Orwell was the presiding spirit of the Congress. Of course, the only thing I'd say in comment on that is, of course, it still leaves open the question of what Orwell would have made of the Congress in the form that it ultimately took. But nonetheless, I don't know the answer to that. In terms of your question, well, one answer I could give is, of course, that Orwell believed he had seen socialism in reality, namely in the streets of Barcelona when he arrived there. Admittedly, it was a socialism tinged with anarchism, and it was very, very short-lived, and possibly not a form of society that could have endured for any length of time. It was a passing a vision, I guess, of the spirit that he attached to socialism. So it's not much of an answer to your question about whether there is a socialist society that escapes the Soviet mold. I guess it also partly depends on how far you think social democracy deserves to be considered a form of socialism. Whether, I think in many ways the period in the US from the New Deal and in the UK from the Attlee government, at least through to the rise of neoliberalism in the 1980s, is looking back an unusual period of time. You can see it in a whole range of ways, but it is a time where if Western societies didn't become socialist, they became at least highly tempered capitalist societies in which social democracy of a certain type, particularly the development of the welfare state, had an impact. And indeed, in the case of the UK, particularly with the privatization of the nationalization of key industries. So it's possibly evocative of an alternative way of reaching a socialist endpoint and of a potential path. on which, for whatever reasons, following the crises of the 1970s, those same societies have, to a substantial degree, turned their back. So not much of yes, I take the point, and it is the challenge that I think a lot of contemporary socialists still face, isn't it? Well, where is the example of an existing successful socialist society that is not on the Soviet model or derived therefrom? And it's a good challenge.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Peter. Hi.
In a way, thank you very much for the talk. And in a way, you've just answered the question I was about to ask. I was very interested in the discussion of libertarian socialism and Orwell. The adjective that actually I'm more familiar with, of his using so frequently, is democratic socialism. And do you have any thoughts? Quite as I say, you may have answered it already. Just any thoughts of quite what he meant by that adjective?
Yeah, it's interesting. I should have some thoughts on this because I've been commissioned to write an essay on Orwell and democracy, but I haven't started writing it yet. But I think my first pass on the subject was that, yeah, again, I mean, as with all these words, Orwell was very aware of their range of meanings. You know, there's that famous essay, is it in Tribune, I think, on the diversity of applications of the term fascism, and then he lists at the end a whole range of words which are equally problematic because they become meaningless through overuse, including, incidentally, totalitarianism, I think, is on that list. It didn't stop him from using it himself. And democracy is probably there. I can't remember for sure. And he does use it in interesting senses. You know, I think the range of ways in which he uses that term democracy do cover what we would narrowly think of as democracy, popular rule, a society in which the people, and not any oligarchic or elite, hold the reins of power. But he uses it in looser ways as well that make it synonymous with something like a liberal society. But I think, yeah, democratic socialism, to my mind, in that usage captures something like the meaning of liberal or libertarian socialism. But I do think that all of these words have some tensions between them. Liberal societies need not be democratic, and democratic societies need not be liberal. And neither of them needs to be capitalist either, but all of these three things tend to hand together. And you know, Orwell himself has a variety of labels for the sort of society that the England he lived in constituted, using a variety of these terms. So I think his application of them was probably loose. He does it, you know, he does talk about the absence of freedom in a democratic society, for example, when he's talking about freedom of the press. He talks about democracy not really being delivered in England because of the persistence of social inequality and discrepancies in power, and so on. I think in the way in which democratic socialism has been used subsequently, particularly in the US, perhaps, you know, Orwell fits the bill quite well. I can't remember, perhaps Peter, you will know better than me, whether he ever described himself using those two words, democratic socialist. He had a shifting range of labels for his own views, but but I don't think liberal or libertarian socialist was ever one of them that he used himself. But
he said every word I've written is
true.
in the cause of.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah.
Of course. Why I write, yes, that's
Actually,
true.
he first used the phrase, maybe in homage to Catalonia, or a discussion of him, where he said, "I've become, because of my experience in Spain, I've become a democratic socialist." That's my memory, which may be erroneous.
Yeah, that may be so. I certainly think, yeah, the phrase clearly. I mean, Quentin's right. The "why I write" statement about democratic socialism is a clear example of that commitment. I mean, I've tended to assume that because of the looseness of meaning, it means much the same as liberal socialist or even libertarian socialist. But it need not, of course. Democracy doesn't necessarily have to be a respecter of individual rights in quite the way that liberalism is. So, yeah.
Well, it's almost a spectrum. As a democratic socialism being gently on the left, maybe socialism itself in the center, but libertarian socialism, though it has socialism, the term libertarian has sort of right-wing implication.
It does. It does. I'm not sure though. I think that's true now. I'm not sure if it's possible to arrange Orwell's use of the language in quite such a spectrum, though. Seems to me more fluid.
Les.
Thank you, Glenn. In fact, there's a lot more in your book than you've talked about today. And there's a section in starting about page 140 where you deal with the raid by the Obscene Publication Squad on Orwell's house in 1939. And I think it's some people will treat this almost as a comic event, but W.J. West in his book The Lesser Evils actually starts with that raid as an experience which he felt shaped Orwell thereafter. And then West goes on in his book to examine essentially how Chamberlain and the Conservative government were manipulating events. So that there is this strand, and you quote in your footnote on page 140 that it's Orwell says it's people on the left who are being attacked for having their mail opened. But I think it's important to point out that Orwell was aware of what was being done by officialdom and the general right-wing tendency of just the Conservative government. Let's have we're both double checking quickly.
Yeah.
Sorry, it's page 142.
All right.
It appears that the opening of letters to persons connected with left-wing parties is now so normal as to excite no remark.
Yes, that's right. Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, but it's interesting. He does indeed say that, but that's not the experience he had himself, is it? It's what he's come to hear, because the raid on his work was for obscene publication. Sorry, the raid that he suffered was for obscene publications, wasn't it? It was around the I think Henry Miller's writing and Ulysses, Joyce's Ulysses, possibly.
Lady Chatterley's Lover.
Lady Chatterley's Lover, was it? Yeah. When I mean, it is an interesting episode, but it's
because what you have to remember is that the post-war Labour government and then the Conservative government from 1951 were both heavily suppressive of literature. The subject of Orwell's essay, Donald McGill himself was prosecuted, I think, as late as 1955.
Yeah.
It's what was going on was appalling, and socially, both Labour and Conservatives were, with a small c, conservative and intent on suppressing anything which was thought-provoking or widening in an intellectual sense. And I think it's worth pointing out that Orwell was aware of this, and which comes in, so like you've got it there in the the Dali essay, which you do mention, but I think Orwell was aware of this earlier.
I mean, it is, I think, a very interesting episode. I mean, for those of you that don't know it, what he says is, I think he's writing to Victor Gollancz, I cannot at this moment lend you Tropic of Cancer, Henry Miller's book, because my copy's been seized while I was writing my last book, 2 detectives suddenly arrived at my house with orders from the public prosecutor to seize all books which I had received through the post. A letter of mine addressed to the Obelisk Press, which is a notorious publisher of such things, obscene works, or works deemed obscene, had been seized and opened in the post. The police were only carrying out orders and were very nice about it. And even the public prosecutor wrote and said that he understood that as a writer, I might have a need for books which it was illegal to possess. On these grounds, he sent me back certain books like Lady Chatterley's Lover, but not Henry Miller. So it's an interesting. I mean, I use it partly because it's in the context of a discussion of Orwell's attitude to obscenity. There's no doubt he would have he was aware of precisely this and the policing of obscenity and the interference in books that one could own, or and the opening of mail, certainly. It's also a nice example of how, you know, how the law was enforced, shall we say, with certain flexibility in this case as well. Some of the books were returned, and they recognized you might, as a writer, need them. But yeah, it is. You're right. It's interesting. And until the Chatterley case and a whole string of trials for the next decade and a half essentially ended the censorship of the printed work for the printed word for obscenity, it remained a real risk on that ground.
Thank you.
Minor point. I was at school when the Chatterley trial was going on, next to Hazel Watson and Viney, who were printing it. And during the course of the trial, their warehouse got overloaded and the yard became full of bales and pallet loads of books. We came out of school, we knew what the result was, because they'd all disappeared. Richard, you've been very patient. Please ask your question.
Glenn, thank you so much for your talk. I enjoyed your talk. I love your book. There's so much which one could follow up. For instance, you say for Orwell that giving offence for him was part of the fun. You describe him as an activist writer, which obviously I think is very important to stress. On the question of his optimism and pessimism, you say overall his optimism overweighed his pessimism, but then you say of 1984, it's neither pessimistic nor optimistic, it's urgent. I'm sure you could talk about all that for a while, but what I want you to talk on is, you mentioned in response to the first questioner, my friend Jeff Denning, the point you stressed throughout that Orwell was a revolutionary. And I think people may have found that quite surprising, because the general view is that Orwell was a revolutionary in 1941, Lion and the Unicorn, but thereafter he became disillusioned. But for you write, while he ceased to believe in the imminent possibility of revolution, there is nothing in his writing that would allow us to conclude that he ceased to consider this desirable. So Orwell is the sort of always at heart a revolutionary. I'd like you to talk more about that, please.
Yes. Yes, it's not entirely. I'm not the only person to have suggested this, but I agree. It's not a dominant view. Most see that, you know, that revolutionary moment that he attached, in particular, to the fall of Dunkirk and the fall of Singapore. Those moments when the British state and the capitalist order might have been shaken by their own incompetence and failure, to have quickly passed. And indeed, it's interesting when he later goes on in one book to praise the English people for a lack of revolutionary spirit. I think the point I wanted to make is that I don't believe that Orwell ever explicitly disavowed that commitment to revolution. He was not in, but even so, the revolutionary element in his thinking was modest, in the sense that he mainly thought violence would be necessary because an elite would not willingly give up power. And therefore, to some degree, revolutionary violence would be necessary for defensive purposes, and to enable the gains to happen. I think that he certainly came to think that, you know, that the changes that he'd hoped and perhaps believed were imminent in the early 1940s, at the time of The Lion and the Unicorn, were going to be not likely to happen soon, but there were more immediate challenges possibly, but that I do think that hope was never repudiated, and the belief that a social transformation would happen remained with him. It was in a sense part and parcel of his belief in the inevitability of socialism, whatever form that might take, positive or negative. And I think also I take the view, in contrast to some, I think, that he was more lukewarm about the Labour government of 1945 and its achievements. Yes, he was very keen to make sure that Animal Farm, and even more particularly 1984, were not weaponized by the opponents of that government, and publicly declared his commitment, his support for it, particularly in the statement on 1984. But I equally don't think he thought that was the achievement of what he thought was a socialist goal. So that achievement still lay in the future, however distant it might be, and it might still require, there's no reason to think that it would not require revolutionary support. Admittedly, I'm arguing from a silence rather than anything else, and that's always, as any historian ought to know, and perhaps I should know better, a slightly dubious proposition. You can never be quite certain on that basis, but that's the sort of thinking that lies behind it. To some degree, I think I was inspired to the thought. Actually, I was trying to remember his name, but I can't. I'm looking around on the shelves for one of his books. But the Belgian, then Australian essayist, expert on Confucianism and China generally. What was his name? Anyway, he wrote a long essay on Orwell in French, but it's also translated into English. And he makes the same point, that Orwell never abandoned those revolutionary beliefs. Yeah, and so that's the argument.
Yeah, thank you.
I thank you very much indeed, Glenn. You clearly stimulated a great set of questions, and thank you very much indeed for presenting tonight. Next month, Ian Bloom will be talking about Tosco Fivel, his mentor. Ian used to work with Tosco, so I'm sure that will be very stimulating too. I look forward to seeing you all then. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks everyone for the questions.